questions are coming. So I got this recording is running. Can I ask you to do an opening bumper, as in something like, "My name is James Kennedy, and I am on the Culture Matters podcast," and then I'll have a second pause,
Okay.
and then I'll get going.
Okay. My name is James Kennedy, and I'm on the Culture Matters broadcast. I am James Kennedy, and I am James Kennedy, and I am on the Culture Matters podcast. And this is I'm going to talk about how culture actually does matter in the Netherlands, and why we need to think about that more deeply than we've thought about up until now.
Okay, well, cool. All right, well, that's the subject I'd like to talk about. Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon, James. I'm assuming you are in the Netherlands. That's what I'm assuming. I want to get one thing out of the way first. You're not related. You're not family, right? To Kennedy, that is.
I am related to 15 U.S. presidents, but not John F. Kennedy.
Not John F. Kennedy. Okay.
No, right. So that's one of the odd things. But yeah, so no.
Okay, so we've got that out of the way. So for the audience, please tell us a bit about yourself. Where do you come from? Where are you now? And what is, I always call this a cultural frame of reference. In other words, where have you stayed or interacted more than a holiday with another culture?
Okay, well, so I'm a guy. I was born and raised in Iowa, so I am an American. I have a Dutch mother. Ultimately, I got involved in Dutch history. I was a bit later, so it was really only my late 20s that I really became really into Dutch history, thinking about doing other kinds of history first. But ultimately, I wrote a dissertation about the Netherlands in the 1960s. And from there, I also started entering into history networks here, and they asked me to become professor of history in Amsterdam, and I did that for about 12 years at each of the two universities there. And now I'm in Utrecht, which is my third Dutch university, and was dean of the liberal arts college for some years, and now I am kind of more back into history. So that's I'm doing other things as well. I'm trying to get the university and society a little more closely connected with each other. So, so that the partners outside of the university become more engaged in how we teach our students. And that's very important. I think also very important to the students. So that's also what I'm doing right now. So I've been in the Netherlands for 20 years, and that means then that I am I probably, although I still spent more years of my life in the United States than the Netherlands, I think the Netherlands has probably had, in some ways, a more formative impact on me, at least thinking about who I am, thinking about what's a good society than just having been in the United States. So that's the country I'd name.
Okay. All right. Interesting. It's then the first question that pops up, I do prepare a few questions. I don't prepare much, so I prefer to go with the flow. And so the first question that pops up, I know the saying, of course, and you know the saying, if you ain't Dutch, you ain't much, right? Yet there's another one, as a finishing touch, God created the Dutch, and all that good stuff. So why Dutch history? Okay, I have a Dutch mother, but there are so many other choices to make.
Yeah, so that's a question. That's a really good question, and you should also say, I mean, Dutch history is done by all kinds of people who don't have Dutch mothers. So there are other reasons to do it. There are people who have also said, why would you want to do Dutch history? Because isn't it kind of a boring country? I mean, this is a country where less happens than anywhere else. It seems to be less subject to the tragedies that befall humanity than in other countries. I think it's really interesting. I think it's a really interesting place because this is a place that, and it's worth looking at because it's often been at the forefront of modernity. Where the world's gone, the Dutch have often been there, whether they wanted to be or not first. And so I think that really is a kind of an interesting place. So in some ways, they point to a future that many other people follow. With all the good things and bad things that come with that. So that's what makes it worth doing. I think it's really also for me personally, just studying here is how do people get along in this country with each other? It's it's very densely populated, and yet the Dutch seem to find a kind of way to live with each other. And how's that possible? How do they do it? What kind of antenna do they need to grow to make that possible? And not only possible, but in ways that is actually kind of leads to their thriving as a society. So that's why I think it's worth looking at the Dutch and their history.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you as a born American with a Dutch mom, you've lived outside of the Netherlands for quite some time now. You've been inside the Netherlands for some time. It's something that I've been outside of the Netherlands now for the last 17 years, Belgium, Paris at this moment. Coming back to the Netherlands and being Dutch myself, born in Amsterdam, there are two things that always surprise me in terms of antennas or how this society works. The one thing is that if you go to a bar on your own, within minutes you have a friend on your left and a friend on your right. They're very approachable. They're very easy to talk to a Dutchman, even in English. They will do their best, even if people think that all Dutch speak English, which is not totally true. Usually it's charcoal English, as I call it. So that's a good side. The flip side of the same medal is that they can be so rude. Okay, it's called direct, and I also know as a Dutchman I can understand it. But coming back after 17 years and then watching it from the outside a bit, is that something that you have experienced as well? This for many foreigners, many Dutch, non-Dutch, very overly directness.
Oh, sure. Oh, I mean, I think that's something I certainly had to get used to that initially, because you think like, do you realize what you're doing? I mean, you're pretending like, or they talk to somebody else directly without even, as if you're not in the room. And so you can feel completely, sort of cut out of your conversation with the first person you're talking with. It can be also that they'll just tell you what they think of certain kinds of things. I do think that is one of the unique capacities of the Dutch. I do think it has to do with the fact that there's never been a kind of a court culture here. So there's never been in that same sense of a kind of an upper class that you had to sort of be polite for, and so you weren't. So I think Dutch society is not completely equal or egalitarian, but the difference between people are relatively small, and so people can get away with saying whatever it is that they want to say to each other in more or less direct terms. One of the things I do note that coming to, and I was just talking to some people who've been like, people who do human resources and stuff like that. The Dutch are very open. You can talk to, they can talk to you. They can talk about anything, and they can say what they want and what they think. But when it comes to like annual evaluation performances and things like that, that's the one area where the Dutch don't do that. Because then for a boss to say, well, you haven't really performed in these areas or that areas, that just is something that the egalitarian Dutch don't really like to hear very much, and bosses themselves are really quite reluctant to do. So it's really interesting that in ways that kind of matter, like, well, tell me how I'm doing as an employee, or tell me how I'm doing as an employer. That's something the Dutch aren't very good at or very direct at, strangely enough.
Well, it's also because, for me at least, doing this intercultural work for some time, the role of a Dutch manager, a Dutch boss, is not to be the boss. Certainly not. Who do you think you are, the boss? No, the role of a Dutch manager or Dutch boss is to create a pleasant working environment. And then this negative feedback, that's too tough. So you're the boss and you're giving me negative feedback. Who do you think you are?
That's exactly right.
They will do exactly the same thing to the king as well, or to the prime minister. There's an interesting clip. This is a little sidestep in our conversation. Then I want to get back to the Dutch. There's a little video on YouTube where Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, is among the crowd of people and shaking and talking to people. And there are a couple of youngsters hanging around. And one of those youngsters goes, "Manu, Manu," as in Emmanuel, "Manu, Manu." So he stops and he comes closer to this little boy and he says, "Monsieur le Président." And he bounces back this little kid. First of all, a Dutch king or politician would never do anything like that. No. and they would play along, something like that. And talking about playing along, and I want to go somewhat back in history. I know your focus is more on post-war, post-World War II, I presume, history. John Stone in English, painter, the famous Dutch painter.
Right.
There is a painting out there of him where he paints classroom settings, or a classroom setting, and the egalitarian side of the Dutch, for me, comes out in that painting as well. You see a little kid that's holding something in his hand, ready to throw that to the teacher. Is that through the years of history? Have the Dutch always been that egalitarian, or do you see any change coming, or in say contemporary times?
Things are never exactly the same in history, but so things change and there's cycles, and the Dutch have had more formal periods and they've had more informal periods, and yet you can say this story particularly about Dutch young people being rude. That's something that foreigners have remarked upon for centuries. That's something that was true
Right.
200 years ago and 400 years ago. So that there is this kind of, they don't seem to be particularly concerned about authority, and they can more or less say what they want, and within particular parameters do what they want.
Yeah.
And that this is and it's somehow also important to show that you are somebody who is a person who has taken, has enough sort of presence to be his or her own person. Yeah. Yeah.
Is that something you would agree with? There's a statement here: a Dutch always has an opinion, even if he doesn't have an opinion. So there's a journalist interviewing somebody and says, "What do you think about ABCD?" And the Dutchman says, "Well, actually, I don't really care." But boom, and there comes the whole opinion.
Right. Yeah, so the Dutch will often have an opinion about all kinds of things. They do it, and it's not a particularly interesting opinion. It's not always a particularly sharp opinion, but they will have one. They will discourse upon it. That tends to be their idea. So they are not afraid of sharing their opinion, by and large, and so that's something they certainly do. One thing I do notice is that for the Dutch to be direct is not always the same thing to say the Dutch will always tell you exactly what they're thinking. Those are two different things. Their directness has a purpose. They want to tell you something, I think you should really wash your windows, or I think you should really, this or that. I mean, they tell you this because they think that will have some kind of effect. But they're not fools in the sense that they will say something that will get them into a lot of hot water, most. So, although again, their capacity to do that, there's been a study in the last 10 years or something like that. The Dutch can really, because the Dutch think they can say anything to anyone, that they've gotten into trouble in other cultures. So their capacity to understand when they should hold their tongue and when they can't is not infallible.
Yeah, that's true. In my spare time, it's something totally different I do. I give cycle tours to tourists in Paris, which is something totally different than from what I'm doing right here, right? And then I'm a Dutch guy, and I do English and I do Dutch, and then I always have to tell the Dutch, listen, don't go through a red light, even if you're Dutch. Don't use your phone while you're cycling, even if you're Dutch, because the police is different. People have respect for the police here in Paris or in France. Much different from the situation in the Netherlands. If you go back to history, then have the Dutch changed in any way? Oh, say from 1600, I don't know, or from the year 1000, or has the Dutch culture changed in any way fundamentally?
Oh, well, I think all kinds of ways in which you can sort of say that Dutch culture has changed a lot. I mean, one evidence is of course, it's a lot less religious culture than it used to be, right? So, I mean, this was a country that was precisely because of the divisions in religion that it really mattered a lot to people, and it matters to people less. So, I mean, so the whole attitude toward life, you could say, in some ways, is different, right? So there's But you can also say that in more recent times, I think that I think sobriety was very important for the Dutch. I mean, you had a sort of a sobriety. I should really use the word, being not showing a lot of money. Right? If it was okay to have money, it wasn't so good to show it.
Calvinistic.
At least Calvinistic is often the term that's used to describe that. So that there's this kind of like, it's somehow not, and there is maybe a kind of a almost the religious or certainly moral precept behind it, right? That, that showing money is somehow not only bad taste,
dirty,
but somehow immoral, and so, and I don't know if the Dutch have that now in the same way. I still don't think they like rich people throwing their weight around and, being really, really ostentatious. But I think the Dutch are a lot more comfortable with wealth and showing wealth than they used to be. So I think that's a difference that's maybe taken place in my lifetime. So those are a couple. One's a much longer range one, and one's a sort of a shorter range ways in which I think the Dutch have changed over time.
Okay. Also, that's interesting. There's another typical Dutch phenomenon. It's not only Dutch, the Scandinavians suffer, quote unquote, from the same thing, which is this consensus seeking, or using a Dutch word, polderen. Keep on talking about everything or anything. If there's more violence in public transportation in Amsterdam, the solution to that is to talk about it, which for me is, I mean, having been away 17 years, from talking about something is not going to solve it. Doing something will actually solve something. Is that something that the Dutch have always done, this consensus, this talking and talking and talking to finding solutions? Or is that really a recent thing? You understand what I'm saying, right?
I certainly do, and it's one of the questions that historians are really quite divided about. Right? Is this idea of poldering, just that word we use? That's only from the 1990s. I mean, that hasn't even been around that long as a concept. It's something that Dutch Prime Minister Wim Kok used, in his time, most, and that's sort of when it started sticking. But yeah, I think generally speaking, this is an oligarchic culture. I mean, that's to say, in the first place. So there's one thing you have to know about this country, I think, is one of the continuities is that nobody has ever or almost ever been the boss just by himself, right? So it's always been a bunch of people that have ruled at the same time. And the only way that a bunch of people could actually rule together, once I figured out that trying to kill each other or steal each other's property wasn't the way to go. The only other way you could do is by just doing a lot of talking. And so there is a kind of a long talk culture. It's a kind of way of governance that you just have to work things out with people because there's no other way to do it. You can't just make executive decisions by yourself, and you can't go over to action unless you've actually, thoroughly chewed the fat ahead of time. So, I mean, there have been moments, more authoritarian moments in Dutch culture where that's less the case, where talking has mattered less. But I think talking's been kind of important in this culture for many centuries. It's not always the best way of dealing with things, as you've already sort of suggested. I mean, it could be that you've got a kind of a situation where, especially in crisis, spending long times conversing with each other isn't probably the best way to do things. You need to make decisions quickly.
Indeed, if your ship is sinking, you cannot hold a meeting about it. You should.
That's right. No, that's right. Yeah.
That's
right. And I assume that right. And I assume that there have been lots of Dutch ships sinking in Dutch history. And I think there've probably been moments when they say, "Okay, well, talking isn't going to help here." But it is deeply baked into it. And there is this, I think that even in the Dutch are more polarized now than they were, 10 or 20 years ago. But still, the Dutch impulse is to sort of seek consensus where you can. And see if you can't get further that way. Yeah, I noticed that in all kinds of ways. It still strikes me as an American.
It still hurts, or are you still confused by it?
Well, I was initially confused by it, but then again, this is sort of says maybe something that just makes it a little different. So one of the things when I came to this country, and then I was asked to be chair of particular kinds of meetings, and I did that in the American ways. When you're a chair, in America, then actually, you're kind of a procedural chair person, right? So you just make sure that everybody gets a say, and then then sort of the egalitarian side of American culture, kicks in, and something like that. So Americans can be very hierarchical, or they can be very flat, right? So and the technical chair is kind of egalitarian, but that didn't work in the Netherlands. What was expected of me is that, yes, I had to listen to what people had to say at the meeting. I had also make a judgment of whose remarks counted for most. And then on the basis of hearing what I had heard, it was expected for me to make a decision about how to move forward. Right? So that I had to cut the Gordian knot and say, okay, having heard all of this, we're gonna do it this way. And so so it was expected that that the chair would need the authority to actually make the final decision. So that's for me, it was key understanding or insight into how the Dutch are not a completely, everybody gets a say at the table. No, some people get more of a say at the table than others, and the chair gets the most of all.
That's a good one. It's interesting. It's another. I'm touching on these typical Dutch things, at least for me, that I know that non-Dutch find interesting to some extent, and putting that in a historical context. Tolerance. The Dutch are pretty well known for their tolerance. The French are known for, if for Americans, if you put it made in France, then they will pay double. If you put in the rest of the world, if you put made in Germany, then you don't even doubt whether it's good or bad. It's always good. Right. And the Dutch are then known, they've marketed the word their tolerance really well in terms of tolerance towards prostitution, if you want, tolerance towards drugs, etc. I've heard many times from non-Dutch, and me asking the question, they asking me the question, do you smoke? No, and they're implying, do you smoke marijuana? No, I don't. I don't smoke at all. Is this tolerance, are the Dutch really tolerant, or are they indifferent? In other words, they don't really care what you do as long as you leave me alone. And has that been the case all over time?
I think that there is I think there are three levels of tolerance. That sounds already kind of pedantic to talk about three, but one of them is, of course, indifference. I mean, this is a commercial culture where everybody kind of does their own thing. It's a diverse culture, and the best way to sort of deal with that is just by having a kind of a almost disciplined indifference to what other people are doing. One American said to me that he got one of those little garden plots in Amsterdam, and he got like these ton of manuals about how he had to do all kinds of things. And he said, I learned that actually there are only two rules. One is, it just basically was, you can do whatever you want as long as nobody else is bothered by it, right? So those are the two, the two things you just had to keep in mind. So the Dutch have this kind of thing of, there's no other way to make a culture that's so diverse and, with people coming from all over the world to work, other than to have a kind of a almost disciplined, as I said, indifference to what other people are doing. I do think, on the other hand, this is also a country where lots of people have thought conflicting things at the same time, and so tolerance also is just meaning that sometimes when you are you really don't agree with somebody else, you just have to learn how to kind of hold your tongue. That's what I also said before. I mean, you can be direct, but you don't say everything you think, and so sometimes tolerance is also just like, in order to keep the peace, I need to just keep my mouth, or I need to think about this in a different way than using my club or my sword or my mouth against people who think the wrong ways. So I think part of it is it's just a kind of a conflict avoidance strategy.
Yes.
It's some deeply held principles. Right. It's not that they're indifferent, but they can't let themselves go. And I think there's another one, and that's also here in this country, is that people really, there is a side of genuine tolerance, that people really like the fact that there are people living next to each other, and that they actually kind of think it's cool that people have different kinds of worldviews, and they generally respect that and think that's really good. So I don't know if that's the most important motive in Dutch tolerance, but it's there too. Yeah.
And then, I mean, I'm looking at the recording time as well, and looking at your time. Is it is it difficult for say in your case an American or for a non-Dutch to live in the Netherlands?
It is, well, the answer in general, no, it's easy in the sense that, I mean, it's it's an urbane country where all kinds of things are possible to live. The quality of life is great, and those are just things you get by living here. At least most people get by living here under most circumstances. But I do think it's hard in ways that people then anticipate. All kinds of people talk to me about the first year of the Netherlands. They thought this was like a kind of a Valhalla of you get to do anything you want to do, right? So this is a place where there are no rules,
no boundaries,
no boundaries, right? So because people wouldn't tell you exactly what to do. The most common piece of advice I've always gotten in the Netherlands, well, that you need to figure that out for yourself.
Yeah,
dat moet je zelf weten. But but there is this other, but then in year 2, when people get here, then they see all these kinds of hidden rules that there are. I mean, that that it's really, there are particular kinds of expectations about behavior. There are particular kinds of expectations about maybe learning the language or showing particular kinds of mores.
right.
So that's, and you can also see sometimes already in the first year, right, that it's a very regulated country. This is a very ordered country. The Dutch don't actually like chaos much at all. And so this is really, so one of the things I think is a kind of a realization for living in this country is you have to really live in an ordered society where there are actual often under-articulated expectations. And precisely because the Dutch are so like seeing themselves as being free and informal, in many ways they are, they never bother really explaining what the actual rules are to other people. And that makes it extra hard because nobody actually tells you what it is that you're actually supposed to do, even though you are actually supposed to do it.
Makes sense. And there's a nice Dutch word for this. It's an aangeharkt country.
It is
a well-brushed country in a way.
It's a well-brushed country. Yes, it is.
I'm drifting towards my last 2 questions, and one of them is: can you give us 3 tips to become more, well, either Dutchify or culturally competent, maybe specifically for the Dutch or towards the Dutch?
Okay, well, so maybe the first one, of course, is that don't think you can do everything, because you can't. I mean, so that's one kind of for a newcomer that's very important. The other thing is that you can say is that I think that the Dutch are good friends for life, right? So that especially once you get to know them, then over a long period of time, they can be very loyal and very good. So, but sometimes the Dutch, because of their agendas, are hard to make appointments with. It sometimes takes you 4 to 6 weeks to get an appointment with them. But over time, these can be good friends.
Right.
And maybe tied to the other thing is that this is the Dutch look very happy and individualistic, but they're actually they're really quite family people. So pay attention to their, pay attention to their wider social networks, to their family life, if you want to understand who they are, because that actually matters to the Dutch more than they would admit.
That's interesting. That's something that I think I do implicitly, because I have 3 kids and my mom is still alive, and I am still in touch with all of them, and actually quite frequently, even though I do think indeed that the Dutch are quite individualistic. Anyway, so that's a good food for thought. If people want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
So I'm at the University of Utrecht, so they can just reach me at my email address, j.c.kennedy@uu.nl.
Okay, I'll put that in the show notes, and potentially a LinkedIn link as well to your LinkedIn profile, because I know I found you there as well. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much for this conversation, and I'm pretty sure we'll bump into each other in the future.
I would like that.